The wind howled like it wanted to tear the mountains apart. But inside the warm ski lodge, the sharp voice of Mr. Sterling cut through everything as Caleb Daniels stood near the door with melting snow on his jacket and cold biting into his bones, knowing something was wrong even while students laughed nervously by the fireplace. And after the first shock moments passed, and he realized one student was missing, he spoke up calmly and said Raven was still outside in the storm, only to be mocked and insulted by the teacher who brushed him off and made cruel jokes about his background while the temperature outside dropped fast enough to kill someone in minutes. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this story begins with a choice made in winter that would change everything, as Caleb remembered the bus ride earlier that day when the trip felt like a careless celebration. Music shaking the seats, snow clouds rolling. In, and him sitting alone with his survival pack, quietly prepared for things others never thought about, while Raven Wolf sat by the window in her leather jacket, distant and guarded, carrying the weight of her powerful father's name and a life where respect was earned the hard way. And when the storm hit without warning, the bus slid into a ditch and panic took over. Caleb helping lead everyone out into the freezing white blur and counting heads as they walked toward a small ranger station, barely visible through the blowing snow, realizing too late that Raven had broken off, likely searching for phone signal on higher ground. And when they finally made it inside and shut the door against the wind, the count came up short again. Sterling tried to deny it out of fear, but Caleb knew better, knowing that in winter hesitation could be deadly. So when no one else would act and threats of punishment were thrown at him, he chose to leave the safety of the building and step back into the storm, where the cold slapped his face and the world shrank to a few frozen feet ahead, his breath burning as he followed fading footprints and logic instead of panic, tracking toward higher ground where someone lost and scared would go, the snow erasing signs almost as fast as he could read them, until he found disturbed snow near trees and a faint trail leading deeper into the forest, where the wind softened slightly, but the cold grew heavier and darker as evening crept in, and there beneath a thick spruce tree he found Raven curled against the roots, pale and shaking, lips blue and thoughts slipping away as she mumbled about being tired and wanting to sleep, the winter already pulling her under, and Caleb forced her to stay awake, talking to her about her father and small human things like bad singing and pancakes, grounding her in warmth that didn't exist anymore, realizing he couldn't carry her back through the storm without killing them both. So he relied on what winter had taught him his whole life, packing snow against a fallen log to create shelter, digging fast while his fingers burned and went numb, building a snow cave deep enough to block the wind, wrapping her in his emergency blanket and pressing his own heat against her, knowing that in winter survival was about patience, shelter, and refusing to give up when everything told you to lie down and disappear. And as the storm raged above them, neither of them knowing what the morning would bring, the quiet farm boy and the dangerous man's daughter clung to life beneath the snow, while somewhere far away engines would soon cut through the cold night. But for now, all that mattered was staying awake, staying together, and surviving the longest winter night of their lives. Caleb knew the snow shelter idea was risky, but winter did not give time for perfect plans. So he worked fast, piling snow again and again with steady hands while the storm screamed above them, packing it down into a rough dome as his gloves went stiff and his fingers burned, knowing sweat could kill just as quickly as cold, yet pushing on until the shape stood tall enough to block the wind, hollowing it from the inside with his small shovel, breathing hard as warmth built in his chest. spreading pine branches across the frozen ground to keep the cold from stealing their heat, then carefully pulling Raven inside when the space was just big enough, sealing the entrance with snow and leaving a small air hole. And the silence that followed felt unreal, like the storm had been shut off, the cold still there but softened, gentler, almost kind. And when he lit the small survival candle, its tiny flame filled the shelter with a weak orange glow and precious warmth. Then came the harder moment when he had to tell her he needed to remove her wet jacket, her fear flashing awake as instinct fought reason. But his calm voice and steady eyes convinced her, and he worked quickly, replacing soaked leather with dry wool, wrapping them both in the emergency blanket while her body shook violently, a sign she was still fighting. In that cramped snow cave, she finally asked why he was helping her, why he cared when others avoided her. And he answered simply that she was a student, a person, and that was enough. And as winter pressed against the walls, they talked softly to stay awake, sharing truths that had been buried under school hallways and labels. Raven admitting how lonely it felt to live in her father's shadow, feared instead of known, rich yet trapped, while Caleb spoke of farm life, of loss, of learning strength from cold mornings and hard work, of a grandfather who taught him that winter does not care who you are, only what you do. And as hours passed, the candle burned lower and the wind softened outside, their breaths steadying, warmth building not just from heat, but from understanding. Raven confessing fears about her father's dangerous world, Caleb listening without judgment, explaining that survival was not about being fearless, but about refusing to quit. And when she fell asleep at last, he stayed awake, checking the air hole, listening to the storm fade, knowing dawn would come if they endured, while faraway engines began to cut through the cold night as Raven's father gathered his men, driven by panic and love, moving through winter roads with snow machines and heavy trucks, forcing open paths others feared to cross, winter bending to determination and power. And by the time pale morning light slipped into the snow shelter, Caleb was already awake, gently waking Raven, helping her crawl out into a world transformed, the storm gone, mountains glowing under fresh snow, air sharp and clean, the cold still fierce but no longer cruel. And when the engines grew loud and black trucks and snowmobiles appeared over the ridge, Raven ran forward despite weak legs, crashing into her father's arms as he held her like she might vanish, his rough strength shaking with relief, the hard men around him forming a quiet wall, eyes scanning, hands ready, soldiers shaped by winter and war. And when Raven pointed back at Caleb and said he was the reason she lived, the giant biker stepped forward slowly, studying the farm boy who had faced the storm alone. And instead of anger, there was respect. A heavy hand offered not as threat, but thanks, words simple and honest, acknowledging courage that winter itself could not break. And as medical kits opened and radios crackled and the long night finally ended, Caleb stood quietly, knowing the snow cave would melt and disappear, but what had been built inside it would not, because winter had stripped everything down to truth, showing who would count heads and who would step into the storm when someone mattered. The decision was made without discussion when Grizz said the boy was coming with them. And from that moment, the ranger station felt too small for what was about to happen, because winter had delivered everyone to the edge, and now consequences were arriving fast, as Mr. Sterling paced through the night shaking, making useless phone calls and waiting for help that moved slowly on frozen roads. And when dawn came, the police and rescue teams showed up tired and cold, planning helicopters that could not yet fly, only for the deep growl of engines to roll through the valley like thunder. And when Sterling looked out the window and saw rows of bikes and trucks cutting through the snow with purpose, his face drained of color, because Raven Wolf was alive, walking under her own strength, wrapped in winter gear, and beside her was Caleb Daniels, the quiet farm kid he had ignored, and relief hit Sterling for half a second before terror followed, because Grizz was stepping forward with the calm anger of a man who had already decided what justice looked like. And when the door flew open with one violent kick and Grizz filled the doorway like a force of nature, the students shrank back instinctively, winter coats brushing the walls, fear mixing with awe. And when Grizz demanded to know who Sterling was, the teacher tried to explain, tried to defend himself with excuses about schedules and risks and authority. But Winter had stripped those words of power, and Grizz named every failure. Clearly, the miscount, the ignored warnings, the threat against a boy who had tried to save a life. And when Raven spoke up and told her father the man was not worth his rage, Grizz listened, turning his fury into something colder and more precise, demanding legal action instead of fists. And with one phone call, the weight of influence and fear moved into place, deputies placing handcuffs on a man who had thought himself untouchable, while students watched silently, learning that Winter remembered everything, and so did the people who survived it. And when Grizz turned his attention to Caleb and asked about his future, the farm boy spoke honestly about debt, about a family land slipping away like snow under boots. And without drama, Grizz erased that fear with another call, settling the mortgage like it was nothing. Because in his world, debts were paid fully and publicly. And when Caleb tried to refuse, overwhelmed, Grizz reminded him that courage carried value, especially in winter when lives depended on it. And by the time the Iron Wolves rode away, the story had already changed, because a farm was saved, a mother cried tears of relief, and a boy who had been invisible was suddenly seen. And a week later, when engines returned to the Daniels farm, lining up neatly against white fields under a pale winter sun, fear never came, because Caleb knew these people now, and his mother, strong and unshaken, faced Grizz directly, demanding reasons and answers, hearing about honor and bonds formed in storms. And Raven spoke not like a biker's daughter, but like a grateful girl who had been seen and saved, and over coffee and laughed at the house filled with warmth that Winter could not steal, while Caleb and Raven walked the snowy fields and talked about returning to school, about stairs and rumors and fear. And Caleb reminded her that anyone who survived a blizzard could survive classrooms and whispers. And they talked about futures too, hers focused on helping others who felt trapped by labels, his rooted in the land that had shaped him, both realizing that Winter had pushed them toward truth. And when Raven claimed him openly with a smile that held no fear, Caleb accepted, knowing that what they had built in snow was stronger than what others built in comfort. And months later, when the thaw softened the mountains and turned snow into memory, they returned to the place where everything had nearly ended, finding nothing left of the shelter but feeling everything it had given them. And when Raven placed the Iron Wolves patch in his hands, Winter stitched into every thread, Caleb understood it was not about leather or machines, but about standing up when it mattered. And as they walked back down the mountain toward engines waiting patiently below, Winter finally loosened its grip, leaving behind a truth written in cold nights and hard choices, that bravery often comes quietly, but the strongest bonds are forged when warmth is scarce, and that sometimes the world changes because one person refuses to stay safe when someone else is lost in the snow.